see. And we forget about the supernatural side, except the supernatural side that we like. We all want to say Christ was, we don't see him, but we believe in him. We all believe in God. We all believe that there was demons, but we don't really think about them. We all believe that there's angels, but there's also good ones and there's also bad ones. And we don't talk about the things that make us uncomfortable, we don't like. Well, I'm starting to delve into some of that stuff we don't like. And so, but that's what the basics of where I'm taking what we're doing right now. I'm building the platform to get to that with y'all. So anyway, so let's get back to where we were. I think this is where we stopped last week. We had talked a little bit about the zealots. We've been through the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Hasmoneans. We've been through the Herodians, and now and we looked at the scribes, and now we looked at the zealots pretty in depth last week. This was, I think, the slide we stopped on when we got into our discussion, and we just talked about James, the son of Alphaeus, and Matthew, whose also his father's name was Alphaeus. Which is interesting because what I still wonder is, and there's no way to know, because Alphaeus was not the most common name in the Bible. Like James is very common, John is very common, Yeshua or Joshua is very common. Alphaeus, not so much a common name. But Alphaeus, if you look at it, there's almost a connotation of Alphaeus that it looks almost like a Greek name. If you look at how Greek and Hebrew separate themselves by language, Alphaeus almost looks like it may have came from a Greek name. So he may have been followed the Sadducees. And remember, the Sadducees were much more, they didn't believe in everything that the Pharisees believed. They didn't believe in resurrection. They didn't believe in an afterlife. And they were also the wealthier group. But they also had a much more Greek and Roman bent to the way they thought. So anyway, I don't know that for sure, but just by reading the names and when you see the way they're spelled, it kind of makes me think that there might have been some Greek influence on that part of that family, which means that James and Matthew also may have been more Greek in their teaching as a child. And so when Jesus brought them in as disciples, that makes it even more interesting, the fact that he brought in people that probably were thinking less Jewish and more Greek, but they still end up becoming his disciples. And again, I can't tell you that I'm 100% accurate on that, but like I said, when you start reading language and you start looking at how things are spelled, you start seeing comparisons, and that's a comparison that kind of popped out at me about a week or so ago. We also talked the fact that Simon changed his tactics. He went from being a zealot to a follower of Christ, and which meant Christ is now here as a peaceful Messiah, not the warrior Messiah that they were all praying for. Remember, the Jews are praying for a Messiah for 1,000 years. They're praying to have their Messiah come, but they're not praying for the Christ Messiah that they got. They're praying for the warrior Messiah they wanted. So we talked about Judas possibly having had those same beliefs, and it could be why he betrayed Christ. Obviously, he's part of God's plan to betray Christ, but one of the things that goes into the thinking of he might have been a zealot was because of his Judas the Iscariot. The Iscarians, Iscaria is an area. It's a city-state part of, I believe it was south of Judea. But anyway, the Iscarians had a lot of zealots in that area. So it kind of lends you to think that maybe Judas might have been at least thinking he's looking for the Messiah that he wants, and he wants this warrior Messiah. He doesn't get the warrior Messiah. He spends all this time with Jesus, and Jesus is failing him. Think about that in a sense. If Jesus is, here he is, the Son of God, the person he's performed all these miracles, yet the one thing you want from him is to get the Romans out of Israel, get the Romans out of Jerusalem, kick the Romans out, have another Maccabean revolt, and take over the Holy Land from the Jewish people. And I think it's likely and probably highly probable that he turned Jesus in thinking he was going to start the revolution. Jesus is going to he's done all these miracles. He's healed all these people. He could probably snap his finger and kill 1,000 guards just like that. And you got to wonder, is that what Judas is thinking whenever he turns Christ in? He's trying to kickstart the revolution that the zealots have not been able to kickstart yet, but they've been trying. And I remember they do kickstart it, and that's what happens for the 70 AD when they tore down the temple. The zealots finally did get that revolution started. And and this is what we just talked about, and gave up on Jesus' peaceful strategy, attempting to force his master's hand. And I think that's what he was attempting to do there. I don't think it was that he didn't, we don't know what was in his mind, but I don't think anybody who followed Christ and saw all the miracles he performed could think that he's not the Messiah. He's just not the Messiah they wanted. He wanted the warrior Messiah. He wants the Messiah to fight. He wants him to take over. He wants to kick the Romans out. And so I think he was trying to kickstart that. Yet Christ's kingdom is not of this world. We see, and Judas's ploy failed. Because it doesn't matter. I mean, when you go back and you read, and we're going to see this when we start studying Isaiah 53 a little bit later, that Jesus was predicted to be exactly who he was all through the Old Testament. But it's not the one they wanted. They wanted the second coming of Christ. So that was the Zealots. So now we're going to talk about the Samaritans. What do y'all think of when you hear the word Samaritan? The Good Samaritan, right? But what do you know about who the Samaritans were? They're half-breeds. Most people don't even realize, because we're not really even taught this at least I wasn't taught this in Sunday school at church. They're Jews. They're Jews that they started out as Jews again, but they become one of these sects that breaks off from being Jewish to being something else. We're going to talk about how they got there. So their culture originated about the 8th century BC. So this is about 800. So this is about the time where Isaiah is around. Isaiah was around 700 BC. So right before Isaiah comes on the scene as a prophet is when the Samaritans break off. They were originally part of the northern kingdom. Remember I said last week that you had the northern kingdom was Israel, the southern kingdom was Judea, or Judah. The Romans called it Judea. The Jews called it Judah because it was named after one of the 12 sons. But so this is after the split, and so they're part of this northern kingdom of Israel, which would have been up around Galilee. It's actually when they finally become a city-state, it's Galilee, Samaria, Judea, and it's broken out. For anybody who has that map that I gave you, they're right in the middle between everything. So they're actually kind of all around Jerusalem. 732, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. They carried many of the Jews off to Assyria. The Assyrians also planted pagan Gentiles from around the empire and had them intermarry with the Israelites. This is the Babylonian captivity. This is when they're all distributed out. This is when the Assyrians take the Babylonians, basically. And they end up taking the Israelites out of their country. Why do they do that? If you can destroy their language, you can destroy their customs, you can destroy their families. That way, you can start to control everybody and get them to think the way you want them to think. What's going on in our society today? They're destroying our families. They're trying to destroy the families. They're trying to destroy our customs. They're trying to destroy the history. I'm not trying to make this political, but it is political. Everything that happened back then was political. It's political in the sense Satan's got a plan. He can't beat Christ anymore. He can't beat God anymore because he failed. The first plan was taint the bloodlines so Christ couldn't even be born. That failed. Christ dies on the cross, rises again from the dead. He has that plan two. What's plan two? Take all the rest of us to hell with him as he can. And what's he got to do? He's got to corrupt the family. He's got to corrupt the government. The only way to do that is the more people you influence more people by politics than you do by any other thing, especially now. And this was happening back then. If you look at the Pharisees, you look at the Sadducees, you look at the scribes, that was all political. But it had a religious base on how it became political. And the politics became more important than the religion. So Power and corruption. It becomes, once you put money, power, and corruption in place, and then control takes over, and once the control kicks in, that's when the people start being really downtrodden and put under the thumb. So the Samaritans were the offspring of 3 patriarchs, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Levi. And the Assyrian foreigners that settled in Israel, and this is from 2 Kings, the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and to settle them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in its towns. Again, they're displacing the people What, what are they having a meeting tomorrow night at the courthouse in Cold Spring about? You can displace enough people and you bring in the people that you want. What are they going to do? They're going to vote the way you want them to vote. I don't mean to get off track. What was said yesterday in our men's Bible study when Steve brought this up about this meeting that's coming up tomorrow night, what he said was he was told that they said that over 71% of the people that are bringing in illegally into the United States are being put into Republican and conservative districts. Why would they do that? This reason right here. If you displace, and there's no accidents in the Bible. There's no happenstance. God has everything for a reason. Why are we talking about this tonight when there's a meeting tomorrow night for the exact same thing? I did this message 4 months ago for the men's group. But here it is tonight. Same message that's going to be tomorrow night, but in a political sense. It's the same game. It's just now different, thousands of years later. But it's this exact thing that's taking place right now. So Ezra, and this is Ezra 4:2, they came to Zerubbabel and the heads of the families and said, look, let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here. Now, the temple's been destroyed. They want to rebuild the temple, the second temple, right? And they want to now rebuild the temple. Or they want to, so the kings of Samaria were extremely wicked kings. I mean, these are not good people. But again, their influence was not Jewish. It was Roman and Greek influence. So to keep the people from going to Jerusalem to worship, they set up 2 golden calf altars, one in Samaria and one in Dan, far to the north. So you got one in the middle of the country and one at the far north of the country. Now they're idol and worships. They're worshiping idols. And again, you say half-breeds, it's probably even worse than half-breeds. And what the Jews consider them in a few minutes is even more interesting than the term half-breed. So the Jews of Judea considered the Samaritans to be a mongrel race. They literally called them mongrels because they didn't belong in the Jewish anymore. You're Jewish by your mother, not your father. The bloodline's traced through the mother, even though we like to think it's traced through the father. It's not. It's traced through the mother. And so depending on where your mother was from, that's what bloodline you had. And so a lot of these women came from outside of Jerusalem, out of the Jewish. They were the Greek, they were the Roman, they were any other Gentile, but not Jewish. So they didn't like the way they practiced Judaism. They still practiced a form of Judaism because remember, they're still Jews, but they're not practicing like normal Jewish people practice. And this offended the Samaritans. So in 585 BC, Judea is conquered, and many of its citizens are carried off to Babylon. And after 70 years of captivity, when Babylon was conquered, of course we all know the story in Daniel, the Medes and the Persians, the Jews were encouraged to return to Jerusalem. Now remember, this is now the Babylonian captivity is now ended. Everything that's happened with Nebuchadnezzar has already taken place. Now the Jews are being encouraged to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple here. And many of them liked being in Persia. This is what happens. You take people out of their home and you put them somewhere else. I came from Pennsylvania. I moved to Texas. I've tried to go back to Pennsylvania several times. I still end up back in Texas. You like where you end up living. And so that's what happened with a lot of these Jews. They went to Persia, which is Iraq and Iran. And they didn't want to go back to Judea. Only some of them went back. So after trying several times to rebuild this temple, the Jews couldn't get it rebuilt. They're struggling to get the temple rebuilt. They don't have the money, they don't have the manpower, they don't have what they need to get it built. So the Samaritans came in and offered to help rebuild the temple, and the Jews just flat turned them down. Said, no, remember, they consider these people a mongrel race. So as antagonists to the people of God, they were rightly rejected by the Judeans, the Jews, in the 5th century BC, and you can see this in Ezra 4 and Nehemiah 4. So if you read those chapters, you'll see this story. I'm not going to go too deep into it. So the Samaritans petitioned the kings of Persia, and especially one king, they actually went to the king and said, We want you to keep them from being able to. They wouldn't let us help build their temple, so keep them from being able to build it. Interfere with it. Do whatever you got to do, but don't let them build their temple. So the animosity between these two people got worse. Now the Jews, not only do they consider them a Mongol race, they now hate each other. It's kind of like our politics today. A Democrat won't talk to a Republican. Republican won't talk to a Democrat. I mean, our belief systems now are so divided, we can't have a discussion anymore. I mean, just watch what's going on in the news. That here it is again. They couldn't even have a discussion.
What was the Samaritans' motive for
There's no, I couldn't find anything on the motives of it, other than that they offered. I think because of the way when we get into the Mount Ebal and all that, I think they were trying to work their way back into being considered Jewish, even though they weren't really Jewish anymore. And I think that was, from the best I can come up with, is their motivation was to become seen from the Jewish perspective as still being Jewish. And that's the best I can find so far on that. There may be more of an answer to that somewhere, but I think that's the primary reason. Because they still believe that they believe in the same God, but there's a main thing one of the big things they don't believe in is what David did by coming to Jerusalem. And we're going to see that in just a minute. Whoops, there we go. So the Samaritans built their temple in Mount Gerizim around 450 BC. Now, the Samaritans built a temple of their own. They didn't build the temple that David was building. This is now their own temple, and it's on Mount Gerizim. And if you look, Alexander the Greek conquered the area about 332 BC. So this is before Alexander comes in, about 120 years before this. So they build this temple, and then the Samaritans were cooperating with the Greeks, and the Jews didn't cooperate with the Greeks. Now, one way to get along in that society was cooperate with Rome, cooperate with Greece, and they would leave you alone to some degree. But the Jews weren't doing that. The Samaritans were. So in the pass, at the entrance between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, is where Jacob's well is. And this is where Jacob, he fights with the angel and gets his hip popped out of place. But this is where he has his well. And if you look, you can see Mount Gerizim there on the left and Mount Ebal on the right. And there's a little town called Shechem down in the middle. That's where the well's at. The well's down in between those two. And it wouldn't be that important except for something else interesting happens with these two mountains. The Samaritans had their own dialect of Hebrew as well as their own script and their own written customs. Remember, we talked about how important it was to have the language and the scrolls. So even though they speak Hebrew, they have their own dialect of Hebrew. Even though they write Hebrew, it's not the same language. So this gets a little confusing when you start trying to find all these archaeological scrolls as to which one is written which way. They also rewrote the Pentateuch. Now remember, the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The most notable change they made was they added a commandment to the 10 Commandments, that mandating that God be worshipped on Mount Gerizim. Now, that's not where God says everything God did was on the Mount of Olives, right? It's in Mount Moriah. Everything that happens, and I'll show you that later on, everything it's of any importance to the Hebrews happens on Mount Moriah, including the crucifixion, or just outside of that. So Mount Gerizim is called the Mount of Blessing. Mount Ebal is called the Mount of Curses. I don't know how many of y'all have read this story in the Bible, but again, we're going to go kind of deep right here in Deuteronomy. Again, this was written by Moses. And it shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land where you are entering to possess it, that you shall place the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. Okay? Then Moses and the elders of Israel commanded the people, saying, keep all the commandments which I'm commanding you today, so it shall be on the day when you cross the Jordan to the land which your God is giving you, that you shall set up for yourself large stones and coat them with lime, and write them all the words of this law when you cross over, so that you may enter the land which the Lord your God is giving you, a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord your God of your fathers promised you. Okay? So we've got a definite distinction here now between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. So it shall be when you cross the Jordan, you shall set up these stones on Mount Ebal as I am commanding you today. And he's telling this to Moses. And you shall coat them with lime. Moreover, you shall build there an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones, and you shall not wield an iron tool on them. Now these are big stones. You're not supposed to use any kind of iron tool. You're supposed to use what God provided from the earth to build this. You shall build the altar of the Lord your God of uncut stones. You shall offer it on burnt offerings to the Lord your God. You shall sacrifice peace offerings and eat there and rejoice before the Lord your God. You shall write on these stones all the words of the law very clearly. Okay? Despite their heterodoxy, Jesus seems often to have made heroes of this, in his stories. Okay? So the Maccabees destroyed this temple that was built on Mount Gerizim in 113 BC. This is Hanukkah. This is Maccabean revolt. Now this was an altar that was found on Mount Ebal that's thought to be Joshua's altar. Now what's interesting about these altars on both of these mountains, they look like feet. They look like big footprints, big stone footprints. Like God's telling them, make my footprint right here on each mountain. But remember, these are uncut stones and they're covered with lime. So this is actually where they believe Joshua's altar was found. Now, the interesting thing about this is that altar is in an area that's really difficult for archaeologists to be able to do anything with. It's in a war zone. This is out like the Gaza Strip area. So it's very contested territory. So they can't really go in there and do a lot. As a matter of fact, the Jews are afraid that if they make too much of an announcement of any of this area that they're finding things there, that it's going to be destroyed by the Muslims before they actually can find anything. But there was something found here already. So discovered in 1980. It's in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority. The site has been off limits, just like we were just talking about. They don't do hardly any archaeology there. Over the last few years, they've been doing a little bit of archaeology. And they found a few things. They found this. 2019, they found what's called the Curse Tablet. And the Curse Tablet is a lead tablet. Now remember, they wrote on anything that would hold an image for very long. They wrote on stones, they wrote on copper, they wrote on tin, they wrote on lead because it was available and it would stay for long periods of time. This thing was folded up. They couldn't really tell what was written on it for a while after they found it. They finally did some CAT scans on it and they did some three-dimensional imaging on it, and this is what it says: cursed, 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 cursed by the God Yahweh. You will die cursed. Cursed, you will surely die. Cursed by Yahweh. Cursed, cursed, cursed. They found this at Joshua's altar on the cursed side of the mountain. So, you want to prove the Bible is inaccurate, this is not going to help your case at all. Again, Christ redeemed us from the curse, having become the curse himself. And that's what it says in Galatians. He took the curse, our curses away by his sacrifice. Any questions on the Samaritans? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
All right, this Mount Ebal, that was the curse.
Mm-hmm.
But why did God say to worship there?
I'm not sure why he said to worship there. And again, it's kind of confusing, but like I said, he put curses on Ebal, but Gerizim he didn't put curses on. And Gerizim, that's I think why the Samaritans decided that we should worship God on Mount Gerizim, because
Stones were on Mount Ebal.
I'm sorry.
All those stones were put on Mount Ebal.
Well, they were on both. They were on both They did on both mountains. They both look like footprints. They're very similar looking altars. They're on both sides. So they built them on both, but one was cursed and one was blessed. So there's a mount of blessing and a mount of curse. And so the big division between the Jews and the Samaritans is the Samaritans want to worship. They to this day they still want to have their temple on Mount Gerizim because that's where Moses was told to build this blessing altar. But the Jews were told to build it in Jerusalem. So the temple's in Jerusalem. It has nothing to do with Mount Ebal or Mount Gerizim, either one. And So I don't know the complete connection as to why these two mountains were picked when Jerusalem was really the site that the temple is going to end up being. Because when David buys the threshing floor is Mount Moriah. When Abram's told to sacrifice Isaac, where's he's going? He's going to Moriah. God's going to tell him which mountain in Moriah. So the area is Moriah. He goes to Mount Moriah to do the sacrifice. Everything happens right there on Mount Moriah, which is where the Dome of the Rock sits today, where the temple was built. But this is what created a lot of the enmity between the Samaritans and the Jews, was this Mount Gerizim is where they felt like, and their temple was built, but then it was destroyed. So you kind of wonder why they would want to help rebuild the Jewish temple later on. But I think it's because they finally wanted to be kind of taken back into the fold a little bit and be seen as Jews again and not Gentiles. Because they do have, remember, you can be Jewish by blood, you can be Jewish by faith, and they did have Jewish blood, a lot of them. So, but it is confusing. I don't quite understand everything about the Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, but if you read Deuteronomy, it's very specific on which one was supposed to be cursed and which one was supposed to be blessed. So.
Dan, how big a town was Shechem? They both lived in Shechem.
I'm sorry?
How big a town was Shechem, since it lies right in between those two?
It's a fairly good sized town. It probably held somewhere around 20 to 50,000 people. So it's not a small.
So Samaritans and Jews lived there.
Yeah. It would have been, especially Jews that were kind of taken out, that didn't come back all the way back to Judea or go back to Jerusalem. So, and remember, there's a lot of time passes here too. There's a lot of time from when Moses writes this is around 1800 BC. The temple doesn't get destroyed until 113 BC. So you're talking about 1600 years. So there's a lot of time passed here. So there's a lot of time for that enmity to build up between both of these groups. Anybody else with the Samaritans? Again, I wish I had a better answer on Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. I'm sure there's a lot more to it. That I just haven't spent the time to really study those two that deeply.
The one scripture you brought up from Deuteronomy, where the Lord was, Moses was telling them to go worship there.
Yeah.
And why would you want to worship there on some place that was cursed?
Don't know. Why did God tell him to curse one side and bless the other? That's the other thing I don't really find a good answer to. Because, like I said, there's a valley in the middle where the well is. What's the most important thing in a desert? A well to have water. So now you've got a mountain on both sides of a well that anybody's going to want to try to live because, the well, you have access to water there. But one side is Moses is told to curse this one and bless this one. Again, I don't have the answer for you. I will try to find it, though. I will do more digging on that. So, if I'm good at anything, it's research. If it's out there, I'll find it. Anything else on the Samaritans or thoughts that you have? So it's an interesting story about the story of the Good Samaritan, right? Because, you think about that, how much these people hated each other. And when Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan, he's basically saying, I'm not here for you, just for you. I'm here for everybody. Even the people you hate vehemently, you call them mongrel dogs and won't even talk to them. I'm still here for them. So, gives us hope for where we're at right now today. At least I think. So, real quick, we'll start the Essenes. The Essenes are probably my favorite group out of all the different sects of the Jews that split off, because they kind of didn't split off. This is the group, you heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls, okay? They're found in Qumran. They're found in 1948, or 47 actually. A shepherd boy takes a stone. He's looking for some sheep that he's out, and he takes a stone and he throws it into a cave, and he hears a shatter, like a pot shattering, like a clay jar. And so when he goes into the cave to find out what happened, he finds all of these jars of scrolls. And that's what now we know as the Dead Sea Scrolls. We probably know as much about the Bible, especially the Old Testament, and actually quite a bit about the New Testament when we get into the Essenes a little bit further. Why they thought the way they believed was probably closest to all the original Jewish tradition than any of the other sects. They didn't break off like the Pharisees and the Sadducees did. They didn't follow what the scribes did. They certainly didn't follow what the Zealots were doing. And they weren't hated like the Samaritans were, but we don't really know much about the Essenes from the Bible. I don't even think the word Essene is in the Bible. But we wouldn't know much about the Essenes had it not been for the Dead Sea Scrolls. But what they put in there, because in the Dead Sea Scrolls we have the Essenes copies of the Old Testament, which are the oldest known accurate copies. I mean, it shows that what we have today, they're 1,000 years older than any copy that would have been used to create the New King James Bible in the 1500s. They're 1,000 years older than those copies because of when they were written at least 200 years before Christ was on earth, minimum of 200, and it could be as much as 1,000 years before. But what they were was the librarians. The Essenes became the librarians. They were the keepers of this. And like I said, we're not going to get too deep into them now because it's already 7 o'clock. But next week, I hope y'all are as fat. The Essenes are amazing because when we start reading and we start studying what they did and how they did it, you're going to find out kind of where Christianity comes from. Not just from Christ, but from the Jewish part of where Christianity should have come from, where the sects that broke off, the Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, scribes. When I say it all the time, how did they miss the first coming of Christ when they had the information? Remember, these people memorized this. They didn't read the Bible like we do. They memorized it. They talked about it all the time. It was part of their life. It wasn't like us where a lot of us come to church on Sunday morning. We don't spend a ton of time with the Bible outside of church. You know, I use that analogy again all the time of, you know, one of my professors said, and for you guys that heard this again yesterday, I apologize. How much time what are the 3 most important things in your life? Most people will say God, family, and work, or God, family, and whatever their passion is. And when you flip that and say, how much time do you spend with each? We have our priorities. We say our priorities are God, family, this. And really, whenever we look at it, we spend more time at work, less time with our family, and a whole lot less time with God. And it's just the way it's just the way the world works. And so when you look at these guys, they didn't do that. They lived it. And where the other groups didn't, and that's what allowed them to fracture off into all these different denominations. We call them sects, but basically today's term we would say denominations. And it's my fear, and I've said this from the very beginning when we had our first couple of these studies, the people, we're in the same history pattern today that they were then. We just saw an example of that. If we're in that same historical pattern, are we not in the same pattern to miss the second coming like they missed the first one? Just saying. But it's a thought you need to think about. And I'm not talking about for us that are believers. I'm talking about for those that we care about that we know aren't believers. Because I firmly believe one of 2 things is getting ready to happen. God's either, like I said this last week, God is long-suffering and very patient. But there's a point where he's had enough, and how many times did he throw the Jews out to the wilderness? The dark ages of history came way after Christ was alive. So there's a point where God lets us go back to being just this side of an animal and living however we can live to get by. So either Christ is coming back soon, or we're going back to a medieval time period. And that's one of those 2 things is going to happen, in my opinion. I don't know which one yet. I firmly believe the second coming is close, because if you look at Revelation, I think that there's enough evidence there, if your eyes are open, that we're traveling down a path that's got a quicker ending than we probably would. For us, it's not a problem. I'd be ready for it to happen tomorrow. But I have relatives that I hope it doesn't happen tomorrow. And that's so anyway, that's what that's about.
And the Essenes and ones that you think there's pretty good evidence that John the Baptist was Essene?
I think so, and I think there's probably some good evidence that maybe Jesus might have studied under the Essenes also, although Jesus wouldn't have needed to study. I mean, he's the originator of it. But I think if you look at the genealogy of Elizabeth and John and Mary and Jesus, I think you can make a case that those missing years, we go, where was Christ? You know, those missing years. I think he may have been taught by the Essenes, just like John was. So I think, and when I show you what I'm going to show you next week, I'm not going to prove anything, but I think you can come up with a hypothesis that that's fairly, at least a chance. He at least studied Essene ways. If he wasn't taught by the Essenes, he studied he taught without having to study, because obviously Jesus, the day he was born, he knew everything he needed to know. But the way the Essenes believed is exactly how Christ taught. So if he wasn't taught by the Essenes, or if he didn't live with the Essenes for a time, he certainly mirrored what they had in their histories. And because the Dead Sea Scrolls is not just the Old Testament. They have histories and other things in those Dead Sea Scrolls also, and that's where a lot of what we're getting now is. And what's interesting about it is that all happened in 47, right? Jerusalem wasn't given back to Israel until the 60s, in 64. But they became a nation in 48. So 47, they find the Dead Sea Scrolls. 48, they become a nation overnight. And then 64, they have the 6-day war, and they get Jerusalem back. And so from probably about 1970 to now is when 90% of the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls has really occurred. Because when they found them originally, they put them in museums and they had people studying them. They didn't let people come in. It was only these museum curators and historians that worked in the museums. But all of a sudden, over the last 25, 30 years, they've been allowing groups of Christians to go in and study those, groups of Jewish rabbis to go in. And this is going to be an interesting thing, a lot of the Jewish rabbis who've gone in and studied the Dead Sea Scrolls have become Messianic.
I was just saying that too. I was aware of that too.
Yeah. So over the last 25 years, we've seen more conversion of these Jewish, and especially after they start studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there's something there and like I said, we're going to get really into that next week, I promise. Matter of fact, we'll probably spend the whole night just talking about the Essenes. So any questions, thoughts? So, a little teaser. But thoughts? All right, well,